This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were ever going to get any money back. Now Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation. An expert who's backed by the latest technology which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress. And you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
Over the past 75 years, more than 10,000 chemicals have entered our food supply, but the EU allows just 300 additives. At Thrive Market, we prioritize quality, banning over 1,000 ingredients found in conventional grocery stores. Our Healthy Swap scanner helps you find better versions of your pantry essentials without the junk, dyes, or fillers, and everything is delivered right to your doorstep. So shop at a grocery store that actually cares about your health at thrivemarket.com/get started for 30% off your first order and a free $60 gift.
Thank you for being an incredible supporter of the 10X Podcast Group, the home of the skillful art of manipulation. We're thrilled to have you as part of our growing community. If you haven't already, we'd love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Your likes and comments mean the world to us and help us reach a wider audience with our stories. Plus, with new episodes released every day, your feedback plays a vital role in shaping what we create. It truly makes a difference. Your loyalty and enthusiasm fuel our passion for crafting gripping tales, and we're so grateful for your support. Today we're excited to present The Eternal Debt, a story that promises to keep you on the edge of your seat. Let's dive into this thrilling narrative together. Chapter 1. The Encounter. The cafe was alive with a kind of noise that could lull the senses. The low hum of conversation, the clink of coffee cups against saucers, and the hiss of steam escaping from the espresso machine. Daniel Mercer sat at a corner table, oblivious to it all. His sketchpad lay open before him, but the page was blank. His hands rested on either side, smudged with charcoal from earlier attempts that now littered the floor beneath him. He was stuck in his art, his finances, his life. "Excuse me," a soft voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. Daniel looked up, startled. A woman stood before him, dressed in a tailored black coat that hinted at wealth but not ostentation. Her hair, an auburn cascade, framed a face that seemed both inviting and inscrutable. Her smile was polite, her eyes sharp. "You dropped this," she said, holding out a $20 bill. Daniel frowned. "That's not mine." "It was under your chair," she insisted, tilting her head slightly. "If you don't claim it, I'm sure someone else will." Reluctantly, Daniel took the bill. "Thanks." Her smile widened. "No need to thank me. Just being a good Samaritan." She paused, her eyes flicking to his blank sketchpad. "Artist, I see. Mind if I join you?" Before he could answer, she slid into the chair across from him, her movements fluid and purposeful. "I'm Victoria," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Daniel," he replied, shaking it hesitantly. "Daniel Mercer," she repeated, her tone as if tasting the name. "Tell me, Daniel, what inspires you?" He blinked, caught off guard. I don't know right now. Lately, nothing seems to." Her gaze softened, but something about it made him feel exposed, as though she could see the weight of his failures. "Sometimes inspiration doesn't come to us. Sometimes we have to chase it." Daniel chuckled bitterly. "That's easier said than done when you're late on rent and can't even afford a proper meal." Victoria leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "What if I told you I could help?" Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Help? How?" "Alone," she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Not in money but in opportunity. I know people. I can connect you with galleries, collectors. The kind of people who appreciate raw talent." Daniel stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or run. Why would you do that for a stranger? Her smile turned enigmatic. Let's just say I believe in paying it forward. Someone once gave me a chance when I needed it most. I like to do the same for others. It sounded too good to be true, but Daniel couldn't ignore the flicker of hope her words ignited. What's the catch? No catch, she said, though the glint in her eyes suggested otherwise. Think of it as a favor. Someday, if you find yourself in a position to help someone else, you'll do the same. Her words were disarming, her presence magnetic. Against his better judgment, Daniel nodded. Okay. Good, Victoria said, rising gracefully. She pulled a sleek business card from her coat pocket and slid it across the table. Call me tomorrow. We'll discuss how I can help you make your art unforgettable. As she walked away, Daniel picked up the card. The embossed letters read, Victoria Delacroix, consultant. No address, no phone number, just an email address. He didn't notice until much later that the $20 bill she'd returned wasn't an ordinary bill. Scrawled on its edge in faint ink were the words, Nothing in life is free. Victoria's departure left an unsettling air in the cafe. Daniel stared at the card, his heart racing with a mixture of hope and unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just opened a door to something he didn't fully understand. For now, though, he chose to see it as a lifeline. A chance to escape the inertia that had trapped him for so long. What harm could one favor do? Chapter 2. The Unseen Chains. The following morning, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, Victoria's card clutched between his fingers. The email address gleamed against the textured cardstock, daring him to make a decision. The apartment around him felt colder than usual, the peeling paint on the walls and the sagging couch reminding him of his stagnant life. What could he lose by reaching out to her? Taking a deep breath, he opened his laptop and typed a brief message. Subject: Follow-up. Hi Victoria. Thank you for your time yesterday. I'm interested in discussing the opportunity you mentioned. Please let me know how we can proceed. Daniel Mercer. After hitting send, he felt a surge of regret. What if she was a scam artist? Yet, the memory of her calm confidence tugged at him, silencing his doubts. She didn't need anything from him. If anything, he needed her. Within 10 minutes, his laptop chimed. Her reply was prompt and direct. Subject: Re-follow-up. Daniel. Meet me at the Amour Hotel Rooftop Lounge at 7 p.m. tonight. We'll discuss the next steps. Victoria. Daniel stared at the screen. The Amour Hotel was one of the most luxurious places in the city, a place he wouldn't dare step into on his own. How could someone like Victoria operate in a world so far removed from his? The elevator to the rooftop lounge was lined with mirrored panels, and Daniel caught sight of himself in every direction. His reflection mocked him. His worn jacket and scuffed boots screamed out of place. As the elevator chimed, he adjusted his collar and stepped out into the dimly lit lounge. The warm glow of the chandeliers contrasted with the cold steel and glass of the city skyline. Victoria was waiting at a table near the edge of the rooftop. A glass of red wine sat untouched in front of her. She looked effortlessly elegant, her auburn hair catching the ambient light. Daniel, she greeted with a smile, standing to shake his hand. Punctuality is a good trait. I didn't want to waste your time, he said, sitting down awkwardly. Good, she said, her smile deepening. Let's get to the point. Tell me about your art. Daniel hesitated. It's mostly sketches. Portraits, some abstract work. I'm trying to branch out into painting, but supplies aren't cheap. Victoria leaned forward, her chin resting on her hand. And what drives you? Why do you create? Her question pierced him in a way he hadn't expected. I don't know, he admitted. I guess it's the only thing I've ever felt good at. It's my way of making sense of things. She nodded, her expression contemplative. Art is a form of control, wouldn't you agree? The artist dictates what the viewer sees, feels, and remembers. It's a powerful position to hold. Daniel hadn't thought of it that way before, but her words rang true. I guess it is. Victoria's smile returned, but there was something colder about it now. I can give you that control, Daniel. I can connect you with the right people, fund your materials, and make your name one people remember. But there's a price. His stomach sank. I thought you said this wasn't about money. It's not, she said smoothly. The price is trust. If I help you, I'll need you to trust me completely, to follow my guidance without question. That's all I ask. Her gaze was piercing, holding him in place like a predator cornering its prey. Can you do that? Daniel swallowed hard. He thought about the years of rejection, the nights spent doubting himself, and the gnawing fear that he would never escape his mediocre existence. Yes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can. Good. Victoria's smile returned, warmer this time. She reached into her purse and pulled out a slim envelope, sliding it across the table. Your first step. Use this to buy supplies, whatever you need to create something extraordinary. Then bring your work to me. Daniel opened the envelope, his breath hitching at the sight of crisp $100 bills. This is a lot. It's an investment, she said, rising from her seat. Don't disappoint me. Over the next week, Daniel threw himself into his work with a fervor he hadn't felt in years. He purchased high-quality canvases, oils, and brushes, transforming his small apartment into a chaotic studio. The piece he created was unlike anything he'd ever done, a haunting portrait of a faceless figure surrounded by shadows. It felt raw, vulnerable, and deeply personal. When he showed it to Victoria, her reaction was immediate. She studied it with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, her fingers grazing the edge of the canvas. It's perfect, she said finally. This will be your introduction to the world. I've arranged for it to be displayed at a private gallery showing next week. Daniel blinked. You've already arranged that. I told you, Daniel, she said, her smile never wavering. Trust me. For a moment, he felt a surge of gratitude. But as Victoria turned to leave, the room seemed to grow colder. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line he didn't fully understand. The debt, it seemed, was only beginning. Chapter 3. The First Task. The gallery was a far cry from the cramped spaces Daniel usually frequented. Ornate chandeliers hung from high ceilings, casting golden light on the walls adorned with carefully curated artwork. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with trays of champagne flutes, and the air buzzed with hushed conversation and laughter. Daniel stood near the edge of the room, nervously sipping his drink. His painting, The Faceless Shadow, hung prominently in the center of the main wall. He had never seen his work displayed like this before, under flattering lighting that seemed to amplify its intensity. It's mesmerizing, a voice said beside him. Daniel turned to find a middle-aged man in an expensive suit studying the painting. His silver hair was slicked back, and he exuded an air of authority. You're the artist, aren't you? The man asked, extending a hand. Richard Matheson. I run the Matheson Foundation for the Arts. Daniel Mercer, Daniel replied, shaking his hand. Victoria was right about you, Richard said with a smile. She has an eye for talent, but more importantly, she has a gift for recognizing potential. This piece. It's evocative. I'd like to discuss featuring your work in one of our upcoming exhibitions. Daniel's heart leaped. I thank you. That would be incredible. Richard handed him a sleek business card. Call my assistant tomorrow. Let's make it happen. As Richard walked away, Daniel felt a surge of exhilaration. For the first time in years, he saw a glimmer of hope, a path forward. He turned to find Victoria standing across the room, watching him with a faint smile. She raised her glass in a silent toast, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The next morning, Daniel received a message from Victoria. Meet me at 10 p.m. tonight. Warehouse 14 on Pier Street. I have a task for you. The message unsettled him. He had expected her to follow up about the gallery or maybe offer advice on his next piece, not summon him to a location that sounded ominous. But he owed her, didn't he? Without her, His painting wouldn't have been displayed, and Richard Matheson wouldn't have noticed him. When he arrived at the warehouse that night, the air was heavy with the scent of salt and rust. The area was deserted, the only sound the distant hum of a cargo ship. Victoria was waiting near the entrance, dressed in a sleek black coat. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried an edge of intensity. "You're late," she said. "Traffic," Daniel muttered, though the streets had been eerily empty. She handed him a small package, wrapped in plain brown paper. "I need you to deliver this to an address in Midtown. It's critical that it arrives by midnight." Daniel frowned, turning the package over in his hands. It was surprisingly heavy. "What's in it?" Victoria's expression darkened. "That's not your concern. Do you trust me, Daniel?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He thought about the gallery, the painting, and the sudden shift in his fortunes. He didn't want to ruin everything over a simple delivery. "I trust you," he said, though the words felt like a lie. She smiled, the tension in her face easing. "Good. The address is written on the side. Make sure no one else touches it and don't open it. Can you do that?" He nodded, though unease churned in his stomach. The drive to Midtown was uneventful, but Daniel couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The package sat on the passenger seat, a silent reminder of the strange direction his life had taken. At one point, he considered pulling over and looking inside, but Victoria's warning echoed in his mind. When he arrived at the address, a dilapidated brownstone on a quiet street, he parked his car and carried the package to the door. He knocked twice, his heart pounding in his chest. The door opened just enough to reveal a shadowed figure. A hand extended from the darkness, covered in scars and grime. "From Victoria," Daniel said, handing over the package. The figure took it without a word and closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking into place sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just participated in something deeply wrong. What was in the package? Who was the person who had taken it? He tried to rationalize his actions. Victoria wouldn't put him in danger, would she? But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. The next day Victoria called him. "Well done," she said. "You delivered it on time. I'm impressed." "Victoria," Daniel began, his voice hesitant. "What was in the package?" "It didn't feel right." She sighed, her tone softening. "Daniel, there are things in this world you're better off not knowing. Trust is the foundation of our relationship. If you can't trust me, this won't work." "But—" "No buts," she interrupted, her voice sharp now. "You said you trusted me. Don't make me regret helping you." Her words cut deep, and Daniel felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry," he said. "I won't question you again." "Good," Victoria said, her tone returning to its usual warmth. "I have big plans for you, Daniel. Don't lose sight of what we're building here." As the call ended, Daniel sat in silence, staring at his phone. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled deeper into something he didn't understand, something he might not be able to escape. The debt, he realized, wasn't just about what he owed Victoria. It was about control. And the chains, though invisible, were tightening around him. Chapter 4: The Double Bind. The days following the delivery passed uneventfully, but Daniel couldn't shake the sense of unease. The memory of the scarred hand snatching the package haunted him, and Victoria's sharp tone during their last conversation lingered in his mind like a thorn. He tried to bury himself in his art, but even that didn't provide solace. His work felt hollow, the creative spark dimmed by a growing weight in his chest. Late one evening, his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from Victoria. "Meet me at the Belmont Hotel, Suite 306. 9 p.m. Don't be late." Daniel groaned, rubbing his temples. He didn't want to see her. Every interaction with Victoria left him feeling more like a pawn in her game. Yet he owed her. Her connections had opened doors he never thought he'd walk through. Reluctantly, he grabbed his jacket and headed out. The Belmont Hotel was a lavish establishment with marble floors, gilded chandeliers, and a doorman who greeted Daniel with an approving nod as he entered. He felt out of place as he rode the elevator to the third floor, his reflection in the polished walls reminding him of how ordinary he looked compared to the opulence around him. When he reached Suite 306, he knocked hesitantly. The door opened almost immediately, and Victoria stood there, dressed in an elegant crimson gown. Her appearance was flawless as always, but there was an edge to her expression that put Daniel on edge. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. The suite was spacious and tastefully decorated, with a view of the city skyline. A man sat in a leather armchair near the window, sipping whiskey. He was in his mid-40s, with a thick build and an aura of authority. His piercing eyes locked onto Daniel as he entered. "Daniel, meet Mr. Gallows," Victoria said, her tone formal. "He's an investor with a keen interest in art." "Pleasure," Gallows said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, almost crushing. "Nice to meet you," Daniel replied, forcing a smile. Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and gestured for Daniel to sit. "We've been discussing your work," she began. "Mr. Gallows is very impressed with the faceless shadow. He's considering purchasing it for his private collection." Daniel's chest tightened. His painting wasn't for sale, at least not yet. But before he could speak, Gallows leaned forward. "Your work has an edge, kid," Gallows said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's raw, real. That's rare these days." "Thank you," Daniel said cautiously. But Gallows continued, "Raw talent only gets you so far. You need to make waves, build a reputation. That's where I come in. I have connections, collectors who'll pay top dollar for your pieces. With the right push, you could become a household name." Daniel glanced at Victoria, whose expression remained unreadable. "That's generous," he said. "But I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of exposure." Victoria set her glass down with a sharp click. "Daniel, this is an opportunity most artists would kill for. Don't let fear hold you back." Her words felt like a command, not a suggestion. Daniel nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at him. "Good," Gallows said, standing. "I'll be in touch. Victoria will let you know the details." He left the room, his presence lingering like a shadow. Once they were alone, Daniel turned to Victoria. "What just happened?" "A step forward," she said, her tone brisk. "Mr. Gallows is one of the most influential collectors in the country. If he promotes your work, your career will skyrocket." "But why do I feel like I just sold my soul?" Daniel muttered. Victoria's expression softened. "Because you're not used to the real world, Daniel. Success requires sacrifices. If you want to stay in your comfort zone, go back to sketching in cafes. But if you want greatness, you have to take risks." Daniel looked away, her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. "And what if I don't want to work with him?" Victoria's smile faded. "You don't have a choice." Her tone sent a chill down his spine. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "The package you delivered. It wasn't just some errand. It was a test. Mr. Gallows owns that warehouse, and he wanted to see if you could handle discretion. You passed, but if you back out now, it won't just be your career on the line." Daniel's heart pounded. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm protecting you," she said, her voice like silk. "Gallows isn't someone you want to cross. Trust me, Daniel. I'm doing what's best for you." "Best for me," he repeated bitterly. "Or best for you." Victoria sighed, standing. "You're overthinking this. Go home, get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow." Daniel left the hotel feeling like he was suffocating. The weight of Victoria's words pressed down on him, and for the first time, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake by trusting her. But what choice did he have now? She'd pulled him into a world he didn't understand, where every favor came with unseen strings. Back at his apartment, Daniel paced the floor, his mind racing. He thought about the package, the scarred hand, and the cold gleam in Gallows' eyes. He knew he was being used, but he didn't know how to break free. His gaze fell on the painting still propped against the wall. The faceless figure stared back at him, surrounded by shadows. For a moment, he felt like he was looking at himself, a man losing his identity piece by piece. Victoria's words echoed in his mind. Trust is the foundation of our relationship. But trust, he realized, was a fragile thing. And once broken, it could never be whole again. Chapter 5: The House of Cards. The morning after his meeting with Victoria and Gallows, Daniel woke to an email in his inbox. The subject line read, "Your next step." His stomach churned as he opened it. From Victoria Delacroix. Subject: Your next step. Daniel. Car will pick you up at 8 p.m. tonight. You'll be meeting a client who's interested in commissioning a custom piece. It's an incredible opportunity, one you can't afford to pass up. Remember, trust me and everything will work out. Victoria. Daniel stared at the screen, his mind racing. He was being pushed deeper into a game he didn't understand, with rules he hadn't agreed to. But how could he walk away now? Victoria had elevated him from obscurity, and Gallows' looming presence made it clear that leaving wasn't an option. At exactly 8 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up outside his apartment. The driver, a silent man in a dark suit, nodded as Daniel climbed in. The drive was smooth and uneventful, but the tension in Daniel's chest grew with every passing mile. The car stopped in front of a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. The driver opened the door for him, and Daniel stepped out, marveling at the sheer opulence of the estate. The mansion's towering columns and manicured gardens were straight out of a magazine. The front door opened before he could knock, and a woman greeted him with a warm smile. She was in her late 40s, with impeccably styled hair and a diamond necklace that glittered against her black evening dress. "Mr. Mercer," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Eleanor Ward. It's a pleasure to meet you." "Likewise," Daniel replied, shaking her hand. "Please come in," she said, ushering him inside. The interior of the mansion was even more breathtaking than the exterior. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and walls lined with priceless art made Daniel feel like he'd stepped into another world. Eleanor led him to a spacious sitting room, where a roaring fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. She gestured for him to sit on a plush velvet couch. "Victoria speaks very highly of you," Eleanor said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "She tells me you're a rising star in the art world." Daniel forced a smile. "I'm grateful for her support. She has an eye for talent," Eleanor said, sitting across from him. "That's why I trust her judgment. I'm looking for a piece that captures complexity, something that speaks to hidden truths." Her words hung in the air, and Daniel felt a prickle of unease. "Do you have something specific in mind?" Eleanor's smile widened. "Do. But before we discuss the details, I'd like you to see something." She stood and gestured for him to follow her. They walked down a long hallway, the walls lined with paintings that seemed to grow darker and more unsettling the farther they went. At the end of the hall was a locked door. Eleanor produced a key from her pocket and unlocked it. Inside was a private gallery, its walls covered with art that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. The pieces were macabre, depicting twisted forms and shadowy figures. One painting in particular caught his eye, a faceless man standing in a burning field, his hands outstretched as if in supplication. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Eleanor said, noticing his gaze. "It's haunting," Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's smile grew colder. "Art should evoke emotion, don't you think? It should unsettle, provoke, make you question everything you thought you knew." Daniel nodded, his unease growing. "What kind of piece are you looking for?" "I want you to create something that speaks to the duality of human nature," she said, her tone almost reverent. "Something that captures the beauty and horror of truth. Victoria assures me you're capable of such depth." "I'll do my best," Daniel said, though his stomach churned at the thought of producing something to fit this grim collection. After the meeting, the driver returned to take Daniel home. As the city lights blurred past the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far darker than he'd anticipated. Eleanor Ward wasn't just a collector. She was part of the same shadowy world as Victoria and Gallows. When he arrived at his apartment, he found an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a handwritten note from Victoria. "Do not disappoint Eleanor. She's more than a client, she's a test. Pass it and your future is assured. Fail and the consequences will be unpleasant." Over the next few days, Daniel threw himself into his work, trying to create a piece that met Eleanor's vague but ominous demands. He sketched furiously, but nothing felt right. Every attempt seemed hollow, lacking the complexity she desired. One night, as he worked late into the evening, he noticed a man lingering outside his apartment building. The figure stood in the shadows, watching the window. When Daniel turned off the light, the man lit a cigarette, his face briefly illuminated by the flame. It was Gallows. Daniel's hands trembled as he closed the curtain. The message was clear: he was being watched. When the painting was finally finished, it was a disturbing yet captivating piece. The central figure was a woman with her face half covered by a mask, one hand extended in a gesture of kindness while the other clutched a bloody dagger. Shadows surrounded her, filled with faint, ghostly faces. Victoria came to collect it personally. She studied the painting for a long time, her expression unreadable. "It's perfect," she said at last. "Eleanor will be pleased." Daniel felt no relief at her words. If anything, they filled him with dread. He wanted to ask what would happen next, but he knew better than to press her for answers. As Victoria left with the painting, Daniel stood in his apartment, staring at the empty easel. He realized he was no longer creating art for himself. It was for them, for their twisted world. The house of cards he was building with Victoria's help felt increasingly fragile, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it came crashing down. Chapter 6. The Turn of the Screw. The night after Victoria collected the painting, Daniel couldn't sleep. The image of the masked woman haunted him, her bloody dagger and shadowy entourage lingering in the corners of his mind. He stared at the ceiling, trying to convince himself he was overreacting, that he was letting his imagination run wild. But the truth gnawed at him. This wasn't just about art anymore. Around 3 a.m., his phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen glowed with an unknown number. His gut told him to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of him. He picked up. "Hello." His voice was hoarse from lack of sleep. "You did well." The voice on the other end was low, gravelly, and unmistakable. "Gallows." Daniel sat up, his chest tightening. "How did you get this number?" "I have my ways," Gallows replied, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. "More importantly, I have a job for you." "A job?" Daniel's heart sank. "I thought I was done after the painting." Gallows chuckled darkly. "You're never done, kid. This one's simple. You're going to retrieve something for me." "I'm not a courier," Daniel snapped, his frustration bubbling over. "You are now," Gallows said coldly. "Unless you want to see everything you've built come crashing down. You think your success is because of talent. Think again. It's because we allowed it. Step out of line, and we'll remind you of that." Daniel gripped the phone tightly, his anger warring with fear. "What do you want me to do?" "There's a storage unit," Gallows said. "Unit 47 at Eastside Lockers. Inside there's a box with a red seal. Bring it to the address I'll text you. Don't open it. Don't ask questions." Before Daniel could protest, the line went dead. The next morning, Daniel received a text with the address and instructions. He spent hours pacing his apartment, trying to decide whether to go through with it. Every instinct told him to walk away, but where would he go? Victoria, Gallows, Eleanor, they had their claws in him, and there was no escaping their reach. By dusk, Daniel was pulling into the parking lot of Eastside Lockers. The storage facility was desolate, its rows of metal doors stretching into the dimming light. He parked near Unit 47 and approached it cautiously. The lock was simple, and the key Gallows had sent worked effortlessly. Inside, the unit was empty except for a single wooden box on a metal shelf. The box was about the size of a small suitcase, its lid sealed with a wax stamp in the shape of a raven. Daniel hesitated, his curiosity burning. What could be inside? He reached out, his fingers brushing the seal before pulling back. Gallows' warning echoed in his mind. Don't open it. He picked up the box and carried it to his car, his nerves frayed. As he drove to the address, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift, every car behind him felt like a tail. The address led him to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The structure was decrepit, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Daniel parked and carried the box to the front door, which creaked ominously as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mildew. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering weakly. In the center of the room stood a man in a dark trench coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "Set it down," the man said, his voice calm but commanding. Daniel placed the box on the ground, stepping back. "What's in it?" The man's head tilted slightly, as if amused. "You've been warned not to ask questions." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but the man raised a hand, silencing him. "Your job is done. Leave." Feeling a mix of anger and relief, Daniel turned to leave. As he reached the door, he glanced back. The man knelt beside the box, carefully breaking the wax seal. For a brief moment, Daniel caught a glimpse of its contents, a stack of photographs, their edges yellowed with age. Before he could make sense of what he'd seen, the man snapped the lid shut, his eyes locking onto Daniel. "Go." Back at his apartment, Daniel tried to make sense of the events. The photographs haunted him. What could they possibly mean? And why had Gallows gone to such lengths to retrieve them? He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hoping to drown his unease, but the questions refused to leave him. Around midnight, there was a knock at his door. Daniel froze, his heart pounding. He approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. Victoria stood on the other side, her expression calm but serious. He opened the door. "What are you doing here?" "May I come in?" she asked. Reluctantly, he stepped aside. She entered, her gaze scanning the room. "You did well tonight." "I didn't have a choice," Daniel replied bitterly. "What was in the box, Victoria?" Her expression hardened. "You don't need to know." "I'm sick of this," he snapped. "I'm not a puppet you can control. You say you're helping me, but all you've done is drag me into this madness." Victoria stepped closer, her voice low and icy. "You think you're the victim here. Do you know how many people would kill for the opportunities I've given you? You're where you are because of me. Don't forget that." Daniel clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. "What do you want from me, Victoria? What's the end game here?" Her gaze softened, but only slightly. "The truth is, Daniel, you owe me. And until that debt is paid, you'll do as I say." "And what happens when it's paid?" he asked, his voice trembling. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "You'll know when the time comes." As she walked out, Daniel felt the walls of his life closing in. The box, the photographs, the veiled threats, they were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't see. And Victoria, with her enigmatic smile and veiled motives, was the architect of it all. The turn of the screw had tightened, and Daniel knew there was no turning back. Chapter 7: The Breaking Point. The days following Victoria's late-night visit passed in a haze. Daniel couldn't focus on his art, nor could he shake the weight of her words. "You owe me." The phrase echoed in his mind, haunting him. The invisible chains she had wrapped around his life were tightening, and the more he struggled, the more they seemed to constrict. On a rainy afternoon, Daniel sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the blank canvas before him. His phone buzzed on the table, the notification lighting up the room. It was a message from Victoria. "Be at the Crescent Tower parking garage at midnight. Wait by the south elevator." Don't bring your phone. His stomach dropped. The cryptic message, the instructions to leave his phone behind. None of it felt right. He thought about ignoring it, but he knew better. Victoria's influence extended far beyond him, and disobedience wasn't an option. At midnight, Daniel arrived at the Crescent Tower parking garage. The air was damp and heavy, the faint hum of the city echoing through the cavernous space. He parked his car near the south elevator and waited, his nerves fraying with each passing minute. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. A man emerged from the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by a hood. He carried a black duffel bag, which he dropped at Daniel's feet. "This is for you," the man said, his voice gruff. "Victoria says you know what to do." Daniel frowned, looking down at the bag. "What's in it?" The man's lips curled into a smirk. "You don't want to know." Before Daniel could ask more, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving him alone with the bag. He crouched down, hesitating before unzipping it. Inside were stacks of cash, neatly bundled, and a sealed envelope marked with the same raven seal he'd seen on the wooden box. His heart raced. What was this? A bribe? Payment for his silence? He pulled out the envelope, staring at it as if it might bite him. Back at his apartment, Daniel spread the contents of the bag on his coffee table. The cash was overwhelming. More money than he'd ever seen in his life. But it was the envelope that drew his attention. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The message was short and chilling. "You're one of us now. Deliver the money to the address below. Do it tonight. No questions, no excuses." The address was scrawled at the bottom. Daniel's hands trembled as he reread the note. One of us. What did that mean? He didn't want to be part of whatever shadowy network Victoria and Gallows operated within. But refusing them didn't feel like an option. The address led him to a run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. Room 214 was his destination. He parked in the far corner of the lot, keeping his head low as he carried the duffel bag inside. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of mildew. A man sat at the small table in the corner, his face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He looked up as Daniel entered, his dark eyes narrowing. "You're late," the man said, his voice cold. Daniel placed the bag on the table, his pulse pounding. "Here. This is everything." The man unzipped the bag, inspecting the cash. He nodded in satisfaction before looking up at Daniel. "You're lucky Victoria vouched for you. Otherwise, you'd be in way over your head." "I didn't ask for any of this," Daniel snapped, his voice trembling with anger. "I just wanted to paint." The man laughed bitterly. "No one gets out clean, kid. Not with her. You're part of this now. Accept it, or it'll eat you alive." The words struck Daniel like a blow. He turned and left the motel without another word, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a boulder. Back at his apartment, Daniel paced the floor, his thoughts racing. He couldn't keep doing this. The deliveries, the veiled threats, the constant fear. This wasn't a life. He needed a way out, but every path seemed blocked by Victoria's looming presence. He thought about the man at the motel, the smirk on his face as he'd warned Daniel about Victoria. There was a crack in her armor, a weakness he could exploit. He just had to find it. The next day, Daniel made a decision. He drove across town to a bar he'd frequented in his younger years. It was the kind of place where secrets traded hands as easily as drinks. He slipped into a booth in the back, his eyes scanning the room until he spotted a familiar face. "Max," Daniel called out, waving over an old acquaintance. Max was a private investigator, the kind of guy who thrived on digging up dirt. Max slid into the booth, raising an eyebrow. "Long time no see. What brings you here?" "I need your help," Daniel said, leaning in. "I need to know everything you can find on Victoria Delacroix." Max whistled. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. You sure you want to dig into her? People who mess with her tend to disappear. I don't have a choice, Daniel said firmly. I'm in too deep and I need a way out. Max studied him for a moment before nodding. All right. But this won't be cheap or safe. Just find something, Daniel said, sliding a few $100 bills across the table. Anything I can use. That night, Daniel lay awake, waiting for Max's call. He didn't know what he hoped to find. Dirt on Victoria, a weak spot, something to free him from her grip. But deep down, he knew he was playing a dangerous game. The house of cards was beginning to wobble, and Daniel could feel the storm brewing. He just didn't know if he'd survive when it all came crashing down. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. The call came just past midnight, jolting Daniel from a restless sleep. He fumbled for his phone, his heart pounding as he saw Max's name on the screen. Max, he answered, his voice shaky. You're not going to like this, Max said, his tone grim. Victoria Delacroix isn't who you think she is. Daniel sat up, gripping the phone tightly. What do you mean? She's connected to some powerful people. Criminals, politicians, even art dealers. They're part of a network that launders money, art, and sometimes worse. Victoria's not just a middleman. She's a puppet master. She uses people like you to run errands and cover her tracks. Daniel's stomach turned. And Gallows. Eleanor Ward. They're in it too. Gallows is the enforcer. He makes sure no one steps out of line. Ward is one of their financiers, funneling dirty money through her art collections. Victoria keeps it all running smoothly by finding talented nobodies and pulling them into her orbit. The words hit Daniel like a freight train. So everything she's done for me, my career, the gallery, was to make you a pawn, Max interrupted. She builds you up so you'll trust her, then uses you. When she's done, she cuts you loose, or worse. Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of the packages he'd delivered, the cryptic meetings, and the unsettling tasks. He'd been a fool to trust her, to think she'd seen something special in him. Max, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. How do I get out? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. That's the hard part. People don't just walk away from Victoria. The ones who try. Well, let's just say they don't make it far. The next day, Daniel felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He couldn't stay in Victoria's web, but escaping felt impossible. His only hope was to confront her directly, to find a way to sever the invisible chains she'd wrapped around him. By evening, he was standing outside Victoria's penthouse. The towering glass building loomed over the city, its shimmering surface reflecting the dying light. He clenched his fists, steeling himself before stepping inside. Victoria greeted him with her usual poise, her expression a mixture of warmth and calculation. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of wine in her hand. Daniel, she said, her smile disarming. I wasn't expecting you tonight. We need to talk, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Of course, she said, gesturing to a chair. But first, tell me, how's the new piece coming along? I'm sure it's brilliant. Daniel ignored her attempt at small talk. I know what you're doing, Victoria. I know about Gallows, Eleanor, the network. I know how you've been using me. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. And what exactly do you think you know? You've been pulling the strings from the beginning, he said, his anger rising. You didn't help me out of kindness. You needed someone to do your dirty work, someone desperate enough to follow orders without asking questions. Victoria set her glass down, her movements slow and deliberate. You've been busy, she said, her tone icy. Who's been feeding you these ideas? Max, perhaps. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. How did she know? She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. Let me explain something to you, Daniel. People like Max don't matter. They're distractions, buzzing around like flies, thinking they can outsmart me. But you're different. You have potential. I've given you opportunities most people only dream of. And now you're throwing it all away because of some misguided notion of betrayal. It's not misguided, Daniel shot back. You've lied to me, manipulated me, and dragged me into your schemes. I'm done, Victoria. I'm out. Her laughter was sharp and cold, cutting through the tension like a blade. Out. Oh, Daniel, you don't get to be out. Not now, not ever. Do you think Gallows will let you walk away? Do you think Eleanor will? You're in this because I allowed it, and the only way out is through me. Daniel took a step back, his chest tightening. I'll go to the police. Victoria's expression darkened, her smile vanishing. And say what? That you delivered a package. That you carried a duffel bag of cash. You have no evidence, Daniel. And even if you did, who do you think the authorities will believe? Me, with my connections and resources, or you, the starving artist I plucked out of obscurity? Her words were like a punch to the gut. She was right. He had nothing, no proof, no leverage, no way to fight back. Victoria moved closer, her voice softening. You've come so far, Daniel. Don't let your fear ruin everything. Trust me, as you always have, and I promise you'll go farther than you ever imagined. For a moment he wavered. Her words, her presence, her promise of success. It was all so intoxicating. But then he thought of Max's warning, of the lives she'd ruined, of the chains she'd wrapped around him. No, he said firmly. I'm done being your pawn. Victoria's eyes flashed with anger, but she quickly composed herself. Very well, she said, her tone icy. If that's your decision, I won't stop you. But don't expect to walk away unscathed. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. Go if you're so determined. But remember this. The world you're running back to is cold and unforgiving. Without me, you'll be nothing. Daniel hesitated, her words cutting deep. But he forced himself to move, walking past her and out the door. As the elevator descended, he felt a mix of relief and dread. He'd taken the first step toward freedom, but he knew the road ahead would be treacherous. Victoria Delacroix wasn't the type to let go easily. And as Daniel left the penthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that the game was far from over. Chapter 9. The Eternal Debt. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and desperation. Daniel knew he'd crossed a line with Victoria, one he couldn't uncross. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting Gallows or one of her other enforcers to show up. Every knock at the door made his heart race. Every shadow on the street felt like a threat. Max called him one night, his voice low and tense. You need to get out of the city, Max said. Victoria won't let this go. She's already moving pieces against you. How do you know? Daniel asked, gripping the phone tightly. I've been digging into her network, Max replied. She's pulled strings to make you look like a liability. You're tied to her operations now, Daniel. If you go down, you take her secrets with you, and she won't let that happen. What am I supposed to do? Daniel asked, his voice trembling. I can't just disappear. Disappear or fight back, Max said bluntly. Those are your only options. Daniel spent the night pacing his apartment, torn between fear and fury. Running meant leaving behind everything he'd worked for, but staying felt like a death sentence. He needed to find a way to turn the tables on Victoria, to expose her without dragging himself down in the process. He decided to meet Max in person to discuss a plan. They arranged to meet at a secluded diner on the outskirts of the city. Max arrived first, seated in a booth at the back, a laptop open in front of him. Here's what I've got, Max said as Daniel slid into the seat across from him. Victoria's empire isn't as untouchable as she wants you to believe. She's careful, but she's not invincible. Max showed him files detailing Victoria's connections, financial transactions, communications with Gallows, and even surveillance footage from the warehouse. It was enough to paint a damning picture. If we leak this to the right people, we can bring her down, Max said. But you'll have to stay hidden once it goes public. She'll know it was you. Daniel stared at the screen, his mind racing. Exposing Victoria would mean cutting himself off from the life she'd built for him, but it would also mean freedom. Freedom from her control, from her lies, from the debt that felt like a noose around his neck. "I'll do it," Daniel said, his voice steady. "But we need to be careful. If she finds out before we release this, I'm dead." The plan was set in motion. Max began uploading the files to an anonymous server, preparing to send them to media outlets and law enforcement. Meanwhile, Daniel kept a low profile, avoiding his apartment and staying in cheap motels. One night, as he returned to his motel room, he found the door ajar. His pulse quickened as he pushed it open, half expecting to find gallows waiting for him. Instead, he found Victoria sitting on the edge of the bed, her expression calm but her eyes burning with anger. "You've been busy," she said, her tone cutting. Daniel froze, his heart pounding. "How did you find me?" Victoria smiled faintly. "You're not as clever as you think, Daniel. Did you really believe you could betray me and walk away?" "I'm not betraying you," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "I'm freeing myself." Her smile vanished. "Freeing yourself? From what?" "The success I gave you. The opportunities one created for you. Everything you have is because of me, Daniel. You owe me." Daniel's anger flared. "I don't owe you anything. You've manipulated me from the start, used me for your own gain. I'm done being your pawn." Victoria stood, her presence commanding. "You think you can walk away from this? From me? You have no idea what you're up against." Daniel stepped back, his hand brushing against the phone in his pocket. He'd already sent the files to Max, who promised to release them if anything happened to him. "You're done, Victoria," he said, his voice firm. "Max has everything. It's over." Her expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "You've made a mistake, Daniel. You think exposing me will set you free, but it won't. You'll be hunted just like me." "At least I'll be free," he said. For the first time, Victoria seemed shaken. But her composure returned quickly, and she smirked. "You've chosen your path, Daniel. Let's see where it takes you." She walked past him, pausing at the door. "You'll never escape the debt, Daniel. It's eternal." With that, she was gone, leaving him alone in the room. The files went public the next day. News outlets swarmed with reports of corruption, money laundering, and criminal enterprises connected to Victoria Delacroix. Her name was plastered across headlines, her carefully constructed empire crumbling before her eyes. Daniel watched the chaos unfold from another motel room, his emotions a whirlwind of relief and dread. He'd won, but at what cost? He was a fugitive now, constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing Victoria's words might still ring true. "You'll never escape." Months later, Daniel found himself in a small coastal town, far from the city and the life he'd once known. He painted in solitude, his work darker and more introspective than ever. He sold his pieces under a pseudonym, staying under the radar. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria's shadow loomed over him. Every stranger's glance, every unexpected sound, it all felt like a reminder that the debt, while no longer owed to her, had cost him more than he could have imagined. The price of freedom, it seemed, was the haunting knowledge that he would never truly be free.